Everyone. Welcome to this week's reading of The Wizard and the Frog. Don't mind all the junk behind me. That's boxes and stuff to fulfill my recent Kickstarter campaign, as well as book orders for some signings I'm doing. So if you live in the US, you can check out where I'll be doing some events through the end of this year. And I'm starting to plan out next year, going to some conventions, things like that. Um, so you can go to richardfierce.com and click the appearances tab, and you can find all my appearances there. So with that said, like I said, don't mind the junk back there, and we will jump into chapter 8. Death comes quickly. Dormers and I made our way carefully down the hill towards the goblin army. The elf still had Pomeria in his robes, which I didn't like, but there was nothing else she could be. There was nowhere else she could safely be kept. I didn't trust leaving her at Theo's house. Any number of things could happen. At least here, with me, I could be aware of her safety. Theo and Brig had circled around to the other side of the camp. Plan was to attack them from both sides, though Dormers would stay out of sight. He offered to use his magic, but I wasn't comfortable with that. As it stood, he was 1 for 3 with his spells. I didn't like those odds, and so it was 3 men against an army of goblins. I drew my blade and waited for the signal that Theo and Breg were in place. Being closer to the camp afforded me a better view of the unicorns in the camp layout. The horned creatures stood completely immobile, staring fixedly at the pulsing red stone between them. Magic, Dormers whispered beside me. What? Magic, he repeated, nodding toward the glowing stone. The thing is powered by magic. Powerful magic, too. I can feel it tingling my skin from here. Now that he said something, I could faintly feel it, too. Goblins have shamans, which is essentially the human equivalent of a wizard, I said. They aren't very strong or smart, so I don't think they're behind whatever this is. I agree, the elf said. Someone much stronger is behind that. Dormers's ominous words added to my feeling of something not being right. A gathering this large of goblins was out of the ordinary, but with the addition of Minotaur gold and powerful magic, I had a suspicion something much larger was going on. It wasn't my responsibility to unravel whatever that might be, but it was hindering me getting Pomeria back into her human form again. Theo should have given the signal by now. I began to wonder if something had gone wrong. Did goblin scouts spot them? Did they get captured? A ruckus erupted on the other side of the camp, but the tents blocked my view. I'll assume that's the signal, I grunted. I sprinted across the open valley towards the encampment, the blade angled back behind me in case I tripped. I didn't want to impale myself if that happened. I reached the edge of the camp without notice, mainly because whatever was going on at the other side of the camp had drawn the attention of all of the goblins. Zigzagging between tents, I managed to work my way to the pen holding the unicorns. I could feel the pulsing of the magic stone more profoundly now. There was a buzzing sound in the air, too. The unicorns were much bigger than they looked from a distance, easily taller than a normal horse. They towered over me like giants. The horns were long, probably a foot in length, with a twisting pattern that glimmered in the sun. Their eyes were glazed with a red tint, leading me to suspect that whatever that stone was, it had somehow captured their minds. A screech caught my attention, and I looked over to see a goblin pointing its spear towards me. He shouted over his shoulder, then charged. Great, I muttered. I was hoping to get in and out with little difficulty. Of course, nothing ever went according to plan. Once the goblin was close enough, I swung my blade and chopped the tip of the spear off. The metal end clinked as it hit the ground, closed the gap between us, and drove the blade into the goblin's chest. It shrieked in agony and collapsed, falling off my sword. I wiped the blood on the creature's dirty armor, and noticed a contingent of goblins rushing my way. Theo's familiar battle cry echoed over the noise, and I knew that he and Breg were dealing death to the goblins on the other side of the camp. I stepped away from the fallen goblin and set my feet firmly on the ground, taking a defensive stance. I brought my blade up horizontally before me, ready for the onslaught. Small beasts crowded around me, hacking and slashing wildly. I took a few cuts to my legs and arms, but they weren't bad. I thrusted this way and that, stabbing one goblin in its eye and another in the neck. One of them dropped to the ground, crawling forward on its hands and knees. It latched onto my leg and bit me. I jerked my leg in surprise, resulting in the goblin getting a mouthful of flesh. Burning pain shot up my leg, and I kicked the creature in the face, smashing its nose and lips. Blood gushed from its mouth, but it could have been mine. I tried to keep my weight off that leg, and swung my sword in a wide circle, slicing wooden spears and goblin arms. Shrieks of pain and anger filled the air as the creature fell before my swinging blade. The hero cut them until they were sour. Their minotaur friend was humming magic and mayhem, gold and power. Here he is, incoming! The ground shook beneath my feet. I looked up and saw a behemoth charging through the camp. It was a minotaur clothed in chainmail and leathers, wielding a staff. He trampled over a few goblins unlucky enough to be in his way. I shoved a goblin and dove to the ground, away from the monstrous beast. It tried to slow its momentum, but smashed through the remaining goblins before slowly turning around. I scrambled to my feet, the wound in my leg burning fiercely. The minotaur roared mightily. It was gargantuan in size, standing a full 3 feet taller than me. I thought the unicorns made me feel small, but this beast made me feel like a dwarf. I didn't have a chance. He knew it. I knew it. For the first time in my life, I ran. I dashed across the camp in the direction of Theo and Breg. We had a better chance of taking the creature down with a concentrated effort. The area around the brothers was littered with both goblin bodies and limbs. The brothers stood back to back, smashing and pulverizing the mass of goblins that surrounded them. I joined the fray, cutting a path with my blade. "We've got a problem," I shouted. Theo wielded a giant longsword. He swung the thing like a club, left to right, and cut down 6 goblins. Those standing behind their fallen comrades backed up, second-guessing if they wanted to close in. Theo looked past me at the minotaur thundering toward us. For a split second, his face betrayed his stoic exterior. It was fleeting, but it was there. Fear. The minotaur lowered his shoulder and charged straight into the mass of bodies. He clipped me, and I spun in a circle and fell atop a pile of goblins. Most of them were dead, but a few were only injured and squirmed beneath me. I drove my fist into the throat and ran my sword through an abdomen as I got up. Theo and Breg were trading blows with the minotaur, their weapons on the ground. At first, it seemed that they were holding their own against the brute. It quickly became clear the beast had the advantage. He knocked Theo with a solid blow to the face, sending the big man staggering backward. Theo crashed to the ground on his back. Breg roared a battle cry and punched the minotaur in the chest, then in the side of its face. It didn't seem to affect the beast at all. I stormed ahead, swinging my blade at the minotaur's legs. At the last moment, the blade suddenly diverted and struck the ground. Some sort of invisible barrier kept me from striking it. "Magic," I whispered, realizing this creature was the source of it. The air around him thrummed with power. I swung again and again, thinking to wear down the spell. The barrier continued to divert my blade each time, with no sign of weakening. The minotaur struck Breg with a mighty blow, and the big man collapsed in a spray of blood from a broken nose. The beast turned to me. This was it. The end of my life, here in this valley filled with goblins. I imagine my end being much different. I think we all do. I braced myself and brought my blade up, willing to face death boldly. Theo's body came hurtling through the air, and he crashed into the minotaur, forcing the creature to stumble and fall to its knees. The big man rolled away, and I swung my sword, seeking to behead the minotaur. Again, my blade was deflected. The minotaur snorted and rose back to its feet. "Gods above," I cursed. "I can't kill the damn thing." "Look out!" Theo cried. The minotaur had picked up its staff, swung the bottom end of it at me. I moved my head in time to keep from getting my face smashed, but I took the brunt of the blow to my right shoulder. The jarring force knocked it out of its socket, and the sword dropped from my limp grasp. My fingers went numb, and an excruciating pain flooded my entire arm. It was too much, and I crumpled to the ground. My eyes blurred with tears, but I could see enough to watch Theo strike the minotaur in the face. I was dizzy, even though I was lying on the ground, and odd thoughts started creeping into my mind. I'm dying. My shoulder's killing me. It's turned against my body, and it's waging its own battle. I have to pee. I'm hungry. In the haze of my thoughts and the pain in my shoulder, I became aware of Dormerus standing over me. My face scrunched in confusion, not sure when he'd arrived at the battlefield. And why was he here? Didn't I tell him to stay hidden, to keep Pomeria safe? I gasped. It must have been too low, because he didn't turn to face me. "Unhand him, vile creature of darkness!" Dormerus's voice thundered across the valley. It's entirely possible I imagined everything that followed, considering the pain I was in. I think I went into shock. The minotaur roared and pointed its staff at the elf. A wave of fire spewed from the end of the wooden pole, striking Dormerus full on. I tried to cry out at his death, but no words left my mouth. The flames faded, and I was surprised to see the elf was still standing there. Not even his robes were singed. Dormer's chanted the words to a spell, and my anxiety flared. He was probably going to kill us all. On accident. A flash of lightning roared down from the sky, momentarily blinding me. As the white light faded, I saw the blast had struck the Minotaur and thrown him to the ground. The beast got back up, and a sickly green light flared from the top of its staff, bathing the area in a bizarre hue. Dormus raised his arm up and covered his eyes, and the Minotaur charged toward him. I wished I had my sword, and that I could stand and fight. I felt the blade in my hand, and the hazy memory of the thing happened back at the mountain. And the hazy memory of the same thing happening back at the mountain tugged at my mind. Was it possible the sword knew my thoughts? If I could somehow summon the blade, could I send it somewhere else? I willed it to fly from my hand and strike the Minotaur. The sword remained where it was. As the Minotaur rammed into Dormerus, the elf's robes were suddenly empty and wrapped around the beast, whipping wildly about. He was gone. I blinked a few times, thinking I was seeing things. No, the elf was gone. The image of a naked Dormerus wandering around without his robes assaulted my mind. Gods above, I thought to myself, that's horrid. And then Dormerus was there again, fully clothed. I felt just as confused as the Minotaur looked. The elf raised his hand and chanted again. 3 white globes of light materialized in front of his raised hand and sped forth, striking the Minotaur in the chest. For the first time, the creature roared in pain. I struggled to sit up and vomited. The dizziness faded enough that I managed to get on my feet. I gripped my sword in my left hand and staggered forward, pain in my leg making me limp. Dormerus and the Minotaur were flinging spells back and forth at one another. Knowing that was a battle I couldn't contend in, I headed for the pen holding the unicorns. The gate was unlatched, but I didn't have the strength to push it open. The wooden beams that formed the fence were wide enough to slip through, so I did that. I cried out in discomfort when I bumped my shoulder against the top rail, but otherwise made it through without too much difficulty. The stone was attached to a wooden pole that had been driven into the ground. The light pulsed rhythmically, and the air hummed in tune with it. The unicorns were still ensorcelled by its power, but there had to be a way to break the trance. A roar echoed across the valley, followed by an explosion. I lifted my sword up awkwardly, not used to using my left arm. I placed the tip of the blade against the stone and pushed. The pole it stood on was stable and didn't budge. I tried kicking the pole, but that just made the pain worse. As I stood there trying to figure out a way to free the unicorns, an idea came to me. I lifted my blade and placed it in the male unicorn's line of sight, blocking the stone from its view. Nothing happened. The red glaze in its eyes was still there. I held the blade in place as long as I could before tremors began to make my arm twitch from exertion. Just as I was about to give up, the haze in the unicorn's eyes faded. The beast took a step back. Yes, I said aloud and lowered my blade. The towering horned creature looked down at me, looking rather sleepy. It blinked several times and shook its head, and snorted. It met my gaze, and I felt a tingle against my leg and my shoulder, much like the tingle I'd felt when Dormus had cast his Minotaur illusion on me. Pain subsided. My body flooded with relief. The unicorn spoke to me, though not audibly. It was in my mind, an extrasensory experience. Where is the Minotaur? It asked. I pointed to where Dormus was battling with it. The unicorn turned around and leapt over the wall of the pen, a single bound, and raced off. I rolled my shoulder, was surprised to feel no pain. I looked at the 2 females and wondered how the male unicorn was going to feel when he hauled off one of them, or when we hauled off one of them. With my strength restored, I cut the pole in half, and the top portion holding the stone clattered to the ground. I picked it up by the end and slammed the stone onto the ground, shattering it into 100 pieces. The red light died, and the unicorn came back to reality. I backed away from them and opened the gate, then headed towards the fight. Dormus was nowhere to be seen. The Minotaur lay on the ground, gored to death by the unicorn. It trotted away, back toward the females. I looked around the encampment. It was empty now. There were many bodies, but many more of the creatures were nowhere to be seen. They must have fled in fear. Goblins weren't known for their bravery. I walked back towards the pen, trying to figure out how we could take one of the females without the male turning on us. I had no ideas. Dormus was standing near the pen, though he kept his distance. I stood beside him and lowered my voice. How do we do this? I asked. Carefully, he replied. I figured that. The male unicorn turned towards Silverwood and sped off. The 2 females followed, though at a much slower pace. One of them stopped and turned back toward us. I pulled the pendant Master Zalor gave me and held it in my hand at my side. The unicorn came trotting over and nuzzled me. It went to do the same thing to Dormus, I snapped the pennant in half, and everything around us distorted. And that's the end of chapter 8. So next week, we'll be back with the final chapter, chapter 9. And so thanks for listening, and I hope you're enjoying the story. And I will see you next week.